The Selfish Giant. Once upon a time, there was a giant who lived in a beautiful garden on the edge of a village. This garden was the most magnificent place in the entire world. It was filled with lush green grass, colorful flowers, tall, leafy trees, and the air was always filled with the scent of blossoms. The garden was a place of joy and delight for the children of the village. Every day after school, the children would run to the garden, play in its meadows, climb the trees, and enjoy the sunshine. But the giant, who was very selfish, didn't like the noise of the children. He wanted his garden to himself, and he didn't like anyone intruding on his space. One day, after returning from a long visit to his friend, the Cornish ogre, the giant decided to build a high wall around the garden to keep the children out. He said, "The garden is mine, and no one else is allowed to enjoy it." The giant had the wall built, and the next day, when the children tried to sneak in through a small opening in the fence, they found it blocked. The giant was pleased with his work and thought no more about it. As the days passed, spring came to the world outside the garden. Everywhere the flowers bloomed, and trees began to bud with new leaves. The birds sang, and the sun shone brightly in the sky, but in the giant's garden, it was always winter. The trees remained bare, and there was no joy or laughter in the air. The children who once played there had nowhere to go, and they missed the lovely garden terribly. One morning, the giant woke up to see the most surprising thing. As he looked out of his window, he saw a little bird perched on a branch of the trees, chirping merrily. "How strange," he thought. "Why is there a bird in my garden when I've made sure no one can enter?" Curious, the giant stepped outside to take a look. To his amazement, the whole garden had suddenly filled with life. The trees were blossoming again, and flowers were growing on the grass. The sun was shining and birds were singing. But what surprised him the most was that, in the middle of it all, were the children, playing and laughing as if they had never been kept out. They had found a way to sneak through the little gaps in the wall, and now the garden was full of them. The giant felt his heart soften, but he was still a little upset. "These children are breaking the rules I set," he thought. "But perhaps it is time to change my ways." The giant went out into the garden, but instead of shooing the children away, he stood still and watched them play. He noticed how happy they were, how they danced around in the sunshine, how they played games under the trees. The laughter of the children filled the air, and the garden seemed to come alive in a way it never had before. Suddenly, the giant heard the soft cry of a child. He turned to see one little girl sitting alone in the corner of the garden, her face hidden in her hands. She was too small to play with the others, and the other children had left her behind. The giant, now deeply moved, walked over to her. "Why are you crying, little one?" he asked gently. The girl looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm too small to play with the others," she said. "They don't want me." The giant smiled and, in a voice that was kind for the first time, said, "Then I will help you." He gently picked her up and placed her on his shoulder. Together they went to join the other children, and they all played happily in the garden. From that day forward, the giant's heart was no longer selfish. He let the children play in his garden every day, and the trees and flowers bloomed brighter than ever. Spring came back to the garden, and the garden was full of life and joy. The birds returned, the trees grew lush with leaves, and the sun shone brightly, all because the giant had learned to be kind. The little girl who had been left behind became very special to the giant. She came to visit him every day, and the two of them became fast friends. The children loved the giant now, for he had a kind heart. One day many years later, the giant was very old and knew that his time was coming. He looked out at his garden, now full of children playing and laughing, and he saw that the little girl who had grown up was standing by the gate, holding the hand of a little boy. The giant smiled and whispered, "I'm so glad I let the children into my garden." He then closed his eyes and fell into a peaceful sleep. The next morning, when the children went to play in the garden, they found that the giant had passed away. He was lying in the corner of the garden, where the little girl had once sat, and his face was peaceful and content. The children were very sad, but they knew that the giant was happy because he had learned to be kind. From that day on, the garden was never the same. The children would visit the spot where the giant had passed away and play there. They would always remember how the selfish giant had transformed into a gentle and caring friend. And in that special part of the garden, the trees bloomed forever, and the sun shone brightly for all who entered. The end. Moral of the story. The selfish giant teaches us that selfishness only brings loneliness and sadness. True happiness comes from kindness, generosity, and sharing with others. When we open our hearts to others and show kindness, we bring joy not only to ourselves but to the world around us.